guys, welcome back to K-pop Astrology. This is Christina Ray, one third of the Fangirls React channel. Now, if you know, you know. We've officially become pleased here at the Fangirls React channel, and we've been really spending a lot of time with PLAVE lately. And honestly, they're such a fun and unique group. From the music to the concept to the community itself, right? Please, it's been really such a great experience to get to interact with Please and see how all of you connect to the group in of itself as well. And obviously for me personally, when there's a group that I really like find comfort in, I kind of have to look at the astrology, because when something resonates as hard, there's a reason behind it, at least in my point of view, in my opinion. But for this K-pop astrology video, I wanted to kind of do a proper like play breakdown, not just because I love the group, but because astrology is actually a way to understand how even their concept as a group, the format that they've taken, the direction that they've taken with this group, and even down to the fandom experience is reflected in the astrology. So again, this is going to be more of a yes, I am a brand new plea. Um, but think of it as a plea that just kind of happens to also notice patterns. So that's pretty much the how I'm gonna break down the astrology for this video. So I want to pull up their chart first. And again, if you don't know much about astrology, that's completely fine, because you don't really have to know astrology that well to kind of understand what I'm saying. So just bear with me. And of course, if you end up having any questions, feel free to comment them below, and I read through all of them. I read through all the comments. So feel free to, if I wasn't clear on a certain section, please let me know. That way I can kind of explain it a little bit better. But I will try my best to not go full on astro lingo here with y'all. But so Plave has a Cancer rising, and that is this symbol right here. Now, one of the things that's super interesting about this chart already is that it's at 0 degrees of Cancer. But if you're not familiar with the rising sign, which is that house, right? It's basically like the first impression of something, uh, of how something feels when you encounter it. And Cancer rising energy feels very soft, familiar, and emotionally safe, right? And it tends to make people feel comfortable very quickly. Like there's already some kind of emotional connection there. And that's especially important for a virtual group like themselves, because the first hurdle isn't really realism. It's comfort, right? You don't need them to feel physically real. You need them to feel emotionally welcoming in the first place. So what makes this even more interesting is that Cancer is also trining Saturn, which adds that visibility, which is right here. It's also at 0 degrees, which is wild to me. And I'll explain that a little bit more. But that trine right there adds this. It's a trine. It is a positive aspect, right? A positive like um relationship in between the ascendant and the planet Saturn. And so it's not just softness that the archetype of the sign of Cancer is, but adding Saturn to this mix is like this consistency to that archetype nature that is Cancer. So there's a sense of what you're experiencing isn't going to suddenly change or disappear. It's very consistent, but it's also very raw. And by that, I mean like it's very like, because it is at 0 degrees, it is the beginning degrees of any sign, right? The signs have degrees from 0 to 29 until they change onto the next sign, right? So the 0, it's like, think of it as a newborn, right? Think of it as a kid, and almost like this childlike comfortness, you know? And so that's what 0 degrees is. Obviously, if it's like 29, that it's a little bit more mature. But 0 degrees, think of it as like a very like childlike, play like degree, right? It's very raw, and it has a way of knowing how, of at least kind of when to happen into that emotional safety, if that makes sense. Now there is a way of also like it developing and growing. So it does have like, because it's at zero, that's the inception chart, right? But what I've noticed is with charts that have 0 degrees is that with time there is a sense of maturity to the nature of that natal chart, of that birth chart. So eventually that 0 degrees, it is playful, but as they move on through years, um, there is a little bit more of that seriousness added to it, but it does take a while. But obviously, that's coming from like somebody's like birth chart, right? This would be a chart for a group, so it does make sense that the playfulness is there because you want to relate, right? So I don't see it as something like so, like super immature or anything like that. It's just that it makes sense for the group, and I hope that I hope I made sense. Um, so and again, like the sign of Cancer is a very nurturing sign, and add the element of Saturn trining that ascendant, and so it brings up that steadiness to it, that foundation, right? So it's not a distant or chaotic nurturing. It's not excessive either, because Saturn does add that like backbone to it, that foundation of like, okay, we can do this in at a certain capacity, right? We know when to stop or pause, which comes with Saturn nature, right? Now, another thing that I wanted to talk about is because they also have all these Pisces placements. Um, Technically, traditionally, it's considered a stellium, modern wise as well, just because we're adding the planet Neptune. Um, and so it takes 3 planets to have a stellium. Add on Neptune, it's a little bit more. So, and the MC line is also in the ninth house. The MC line is pretty much like the highest point of a chart. So it's like the highest point of the sky, right? And so just keep in mind that tradition, like not traditionally, but most of the times it lands on the 10th house, which is our highest house and most visible. But in this case, it's in the ninth house, and that's also important. I'll cover that. But what I wanted to point out is that right here in Pisces, we do have like this their sun, right? They are a Pisces sun group. And so when you look at the core of Plave's chart, is very Pisces heavy, right? We have 4 planets there and a very important angle. So the sun, Mercury, Neptune, and Saturn are all in Pisces, and Pisces energy is very, it's all about imagination, symbolism, shared emotional meaning, and it doesn't function well when something is overly like literal. So it works best when something is allowed to be felt rather than really fully defined. So in normal terms, really, this chart is a chart that wants you to build a world, not just release music, right? And one of the important things that I also wanted to point out is that Sun is not like super conjunct to the planet Mercury, but it is quite close, which tells me that the identity and communication are very deeply tied together in the core of what makes Plave, right? So Plave is so how Plave is and how they communicate are basically the same thing. So that's why their concept, their language, even the storytelling feels very unified instead of like different fragments. So they've done a really good job at tapping into that world building, um, from like just as a brand new plea, getting to experience how they've connected, like their storytelling via music, via the lives, via everything that they release. There's something that connects to it that is part of their world that they want to share with us, right? Um, Now, also the Sun conjunct Neptune right here as well. It's not like super conjunct, but it's still very quite next to it, so that still counts in my book. And Neptune, what Neptune adds to their identity, which is the Sun, right? is that they Neptune adds that dreamlike and otherworldly quality. And of course, this is like classic idealized energy. So it's not fake, but it is sort of symbolic here, right? So it makes complete sense that play resonates through imagination of people, right? Rather than their physical presence. So what kind of keeps all of this becoming very vague is again that Saturn in Pisces, right? Because yes, Neptune is imagination, and sometimes like the dark side of Neptune really is that sometimes it can make things too delulu, too imaginative and no like real structure. Um, and so having Saturn there adds quite a big like structure and backbone to their concept. Because sometimes you can go too imaginative and then people won't resonate, right? Too out of reach and it won't make sense and it won't make that connection with people, which is the opposite, right, of what they want to do. They want to make sure that they are accessible, right? And so again, Saturn brings that structure. It gives rules to the dream world, right? To this dream, to this fantasy concept, right? So without it, this could really have dissolved into something that again, very much unclear. But with it being there, it really holds the concept and gives it a backbone and a structure and some grounding, right? Because Saturn is also um, grounding. So that Saturn right there is actually doing a lot of work um, for it being a Saturn in Pisces at 0 degrees. Now, it is in the ninth house, right? So in the ninth house, the reason that this is really important for me to kind of like highlight really is that all those placements sit in the ninth house, which is part of the chart that's connected to belief systems, to spirituality, to people's beliefs, their philosophy and also shared meaning. So I want you to think of the ninth house as what people can commit to emotionally and mentally. So not what they just casually enjoy. I feel like that would be more like a fifth house placement, but here they have it in the ninth house. So for Plave, this shows up as world building, right? They're not just releasing songs or visuals, they're offering a space for fans to emotionally also step into. And I think we've already released it, which is the our reaction to Pixar World and Virtual Idol and like From in our movie. And I feel like those songs really called for um as an invitation to see the world that they are building. It's like it's not just something that is fantasy and available to you to like just experience. They want you to be also immersed in it. And I hope that makes sense because one thing is going through the experience, right? But immerse is more like you are also involved, right? Um, so they're really offering a space to please, right? That they can really emotionally step into and be invested in, right? Um, Now, another thing about the ninth house also is that it does relate to foreign countries. So I am very confident that Plea is gonna grow more and more. In the sense of like not only really being like those groups that really I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, if they pioneered this movement or if it's been tried before them, but regardless if they did pioneer it or not, they are definitely a group that will make it more known, if that makes sense. Their concept, their structure, and all that stuff is they have the capacity with those heavy placements in the ninth house of being able to be known as like this is a group that like really put to the forefront this type of technology, if that makes sense. So again, I'm not quite familiar with any other virtual groups before them, so that's why I'm saying that if they were the first, then even better. But if they're not, then with this chart, in my opinion, the way that I see it is that they do have this capacity of being able to, and it won't be something like super quick or something that has will happen super quick, but something that will eventually be known, if that makes sense. Because of that Saturn is very early on. With Saturn, time is very important. Time is a big word with Saturn. And so sometimes those achievements do take a little bit of time, do take a little bit of cooking and seasoning in the kitchen, you know? Um, so another thing that I kind of wanted to point out for this sun in Pisces is that it does trine that moon in Scorpio, which again, there's a beautiful, beautiful water trine in this chart. Um, and so trine, when I say trine, it's like a really good aspect, okay? And it supports this very beautifully, right? So that aspect means that this group's identity and the audience's emotional response are aligned. So what play puts out is generally received the way that it's intended to feel in the first place. So that's why this concept doesn't feel confusing at all or disjointed. The emotional message really lands with their audience. And on top of that, with Plave having the moon in Scorpio, and again, the moon is represents like our emotional bonds and attachment. And so with Scorpio energy, it's very deep, loyal, and very intense. So it doesn't really do surface level stuff at all. Scorpio is a very think about how the Scorpio has to like dig under the earth, right? Like under the sand. Sorry, I'm talking so fast. I'm like creating air pockets. um, so how the Scorpio has to kind of like go underneath the sand, right? Think of it that way. Like it is literal in this sense, where like Scorpion energy is very deep, it's intense, and it doesn't do above the surface, right? It's So when people connect, they connect fully. And I feel like I personally even had this experience when I first saw their dingo killing voice, right? Cuz mind you, I remember Koa sending me, I think it was Wait for Love, and I was like, "Oh, okay." And I think I wrote this on a comment as well. I responded to somebody who was like, like I really like relate to the way that y'all like have discovered play, which is like, yes, I kind of heard about them, saw them, and it very much was like, oh, okay, especially from somebody who comes from like, I love anime, I love like comic books, manga, and stuff like that. And so it was something that I was like, I didn't really immediately thought about giving a chance to, just because it was like something in passing, and I was like, okay, maybe I don't know how this is going to be used, right? I don't know how this is going to be marketed. And it was one of those things that was like, oh, okay, whatever. And then we did um the reaction to Boo, and I was like, okay, cute song, but again, it wasn't clicking. And then when we did get a lot of response after reacting to Boo, and people were like, okay, you gotta do Killing Voice. This is way more than just like Boo, right? And I was like, okay. And then obviously mind blown. And I was like, oh, okay, so this is not just a virtual group that is just trying to be like cutesy dootsy type. Like there's something here. And then of course y'all suggested Dash, because we did really love the Dash, what we heard on the Killing Voice. We were like, what? And Chroma Drift. So obviously come Dash, a music video reaction, and we were completely blown away. And so that's when it clicked. And I was like, oh, okay, it goes way beyond what I was personally thinking. And so very much with that moon in Scorpio, um, it it linked, and it kind of like brought out the surface, and I was like, this is not just what you're thinking. This is way more like beyond surface level stuff. And that's that Scorpio moon right there. That it's very intense, but because it has like the trine to Mercury, to the Sun, to Neptune, it really is being supported, even though the moon doesn't feel comfortable in the sign of Scorpio. It is having a really good relationship also here. It's not exact, it won't show it up here, but it's still trining the ascendant. It is 14 degrees apart, but I still consider that a good um, supporting chart, right? Because Cancer is where the moon feels at home, right? Um, so somehow, even though the moon is in a sign that's not comfortable in, it's still having that, it's still facing that house where it does feel comfortable in. So in moments of like uncertainty and stuff like that, it can look to that first house, right? Um, and on top of that, it does trine Mercury, which is very important, because when we're talking about emotions, right, we are also talking on how being able to communicate those, right? And so the moon trining Mercury means emotions and communication are aligned, right? Um, our emotions, or their emotions, sorry, are saying something that they can still communicate across, if that makes sense. Because sometimes when there is like a what is it I'm trying to say? Discombobulation. Discombobulation. Wow. Um, when certain like planets aren't talking to each other like in a way that can be a little bit more easy, like this chart, sometimes we can come across as like feeling a certain way and then it coming out the way, not the way that we are trying to express. So that's like that. So yeah, so technically with the moon and Mercury talking, right, having that positive link, which is a trine, it really helps them communicate to the fans, right? Um, and the receivement of that communication is well received, right? The fans do get what Plave is expressing. And so at the same time, the moon is also opposite Uranus, which adds a little bit of intensity and kind of a, like an emotional um right here, right? Because it's opposing signs and it's actually a quite exact opposition. So by opposition, it's just they are seeing each other, but they're on opposite sides. But it does add a little bit of, you know, that intensity that the Scorpio moon already brings, but having it oppose Uranus, which is the planet of like upheaval, electricity, and sudden like shocks is the best that I can explain it. It it's it's helping that moon with like kind of the impact I feel like that communication of emotions is received. It kind of just like jolts you. I hope I'm making sense. But Uranus is almost like adds that element of like a jolt to those emotions. So and with that combination of moon and Scorpio with Uranus and Taurus, it kind of explains why Plave's fandom, right? Like why our attachment can bring a very like strong and personal, but also dynamic um between fandom and group. So people don't just casually like them; they are going to feel very, very invested in the group. Um, which again, it's like one of those things where it's like once you're in, you're in. And I know you guys know this because that's how I feel. Like once I was introduced to Plave, um, and was receiving, right? It was like, "Oh, I'm sad. I'm locked in. There's no coming back," right? But this moon does sit in the 5th house. So the 5th house is the house of like, you know, creativity, hobbies, performance. And so with the moon sitting there in the 5th house, that emotional intensity is also very tied to the part of creativity that the group is bringing on board, and also performance, right? And so the bond is built through what they create, because the 5th house is also like represent, if we're talking about somebody's personal chart, our children and stuff like that. And so in a way, it's it's like what you create, right? If we're talking in terms of creation, right? Because women, um or uterus, right? Our uterus creates life, and so instead of putting it into like bodily terms, it can also be something that you birth, something that you create. And for Plave, that bond is really built on through what they birth, aka what they create. Um, Now, I also want to talk about one of their most like telling placements, which is this Mars in the 12th heart, in the 12th house. I was gonna say in the 12th heart, in the 12th house of Gemini. Now, one of the things that the reason why I say it's such a telling placement is that Mars is we how we act, right? Or how is action and effort showing up in our chart? And so Gemini is communication, right? It's ruled by Mercury, which represents communication. Now, it is in the 12th house, and the 12th house can represent the house of like behind the scenes type of energy, what people don't see, but what we're working on constantly, right? So, in simple terms, this is a chart that works best when a lot of effort happens behind the scenes, very quietly, not always expose, right? So through systems, through planning and mediation, right? So rather than constant visibility, because again, our actions, right? That Mars energy, that go, go, go energy is hidden in the 12th house. Um, Now it does square Neptune, which means direct action can kind of become a little bit right here. And by square, I mean there is some tension there, but of course, whenever we have um like a square or an opposition, which are considered like energy that can conflict within each other, it doesn't necessarily mean, oh, it's bad. And the same goes for trines and sextiles, which are more of the aspects that are more harmonizing, right? Trines and sextiles are not always going to be good, and squares and oppositions are not always going to be bad. Um, so, for example, whenever you have squares and oppositions, that conflict that lives within those planets can also bring about very positive things. And same thing goes with very harmonic, or like, yeah, harmonic aspects, because of it having that accessibility of like, oh, these planets have like easy communication. Sometimes it can come across like, oh, I have it easy. Something like that. Like I'm trying to find a way that I can explain this. Sometimes having it easy won't won't make it great, if that makes sense. So it's like one of those things like, if you have it easy, does that mean that no effort was put in? You know, so sometimes it can be a double-edged sword. But again, because astrology is a spectrum, sometimes the really good relationships, or the really good aspects that we can come across, sometimes do have like that, I don't want to say negative, but like their shadow side, right? It can have a shadow side, and it can have a really good side. Same thing goes with very hard aspects, which are squares and oppositions, where it's like those can be really good because it'll push somebody to figure it out. But sometimes it can manifest very um if not knowing how to manage that conflict within those planets, it can sometimes do come across very conflicting, right? If the person doesn't know how to manage that conflict. But just wanted to get that. I don't mean that when I talk about Mars squaring Neptune can mean like direct action, right? Because we have Mars, but that direct action can also become very scattered if it isn't carefully structured, right? So this is one of the reasons why the way that they've been able to control formats matters here. Um, so the virtual structure really supports how this chart wants to operate and allows Plave to communicate and perform in a way that stays very intentional instead of very chaotic. Because again, this could have very manifested some a little bit of chaos, and by chaos I mean the distance between virtual idol versus physical idol could have been that distinction could have been very much at the forefront of the group instead of something that is like accepted. And so the distance between virtual idol or the difference between a physical and virtual idol could have been more of the highlight, but the format, the way that they are so very much involved with the design process, the way that their world is, they are unfolding their world, right? And the fact that they schedule lives and are constantly being played is that structure, is that commitment, it's that consistency that a virtual idol group needs and that works for this chart in particularly. And that's why this format actually helps the function of the group more clearly, if that makes sense. Because again, initial thought of a virtual idol is like, okay, like why invest my time in a group that, I'm not gonna physically be able to touch, see, right? Um, but if you think about the way that they are inviting you into their world, there's no need for that tactile, right? Um, what is it? Need or want or necessity is what I'm trying to say. So because they are constantly, you know, being present as Plave, that is how they are able to communicate and to really keep expanding on the world that is their world, right? So I hope it makes sense there. Try not to go astrolingo on y'all. um, so now moving on away from the 12th house, I do want to talk about the 10th house of Aries. And if you know, you know, Aries is a bold sign, initiating and forward moving, forward thinking, and it kind of gives Plave this public presence that feels very confident, even with like the soft, dreamy core that they have, right? That kind of has that Piscean and Cancer energy. And of course, at the 10th house, we do have a Venus and Jupiter, which I really, really love for them because those two are like the benefics of astrology, right? So um, they tend to bring nice things, right? Especially if you have, and of course, this chart is a noon chart. Um, and that means that Jupiter is the benefic of sect. So for daytime charts, Jupiter is like your fairy godmother. And if you have a night chart, it's Venus. Um, and so, but you have both night fairy godmother and daytime fairy godmother. So I really like that for them. Mind you, Chiron is there, which is like our the asteroid that it represents our wounds, right? But that Venus does kind of bring like a balance to this chart as well, because if you see here, Mars in the 12th house, right? How we move with action and all that stuff, like we said, can have that little bit of difficulty with Pisces. Now, I understand that Saturn is all the way at 0 degrees and 23. Like, that's a lot of degrees, right? Apart. But the way that I practice astrology is that I still consider that Saturn to bring a lot of influence to this ninth house of Pisces. So not only is Mars having a direct relationship with Saturn and Neptune, because that Mars and Neptune can would have had a little bit of a scatteredness to it, that Saturn helps. And on top of that, bring in Venus. Venus is the sign of like harmony and all that stuff. Now, mind you, in Aries, it's not where it's most comfortable in. However, that Venus is looking at Mars. So Mars is the sign that rules Aries. So there is some sort of support here that the 10th house has from Mars, even though Mars is not like at home in Gemini, it's neutral. But it does have the support of, it might not be comfortable in Venus's house, but it still has a direct eyesight to its own house, right? So it does that relationship between Mars and Venus does add chemistry and appeal to their presence, right? And another thing is that Venus does square Pluto here in Capricorn at 29 degrees. So it gives their image like a little bit more of emotional weight. So there's intensity of how people perceive them because Pluto can be very intense. And it likes to kind of like shake things up in the way of like uprooting or like bringing to the surface. And so that can come across with like the intensity of how people perceive them and why for some reason they get hate for just being virtual idols. But at the same time, it makes sense why Plave doesn't feel passive or like very vague publicly. Even though their concept is like very much like soft and gentle and imaginative, the direction is very much clear thanks to that 10th house in Aries. Um, Now, that is kind of like a little read into all the placements that they have. I can go on another hour probably talking about this chart, but one thing that I did want to at least talk to you guys today about is that their upcoming, their third anniversary is coming. And I kind of wanted to kind of give you guys a little bit of what that might look like. So bear with me. Let me pull up their anniversary chart. Let's see. Okay, so inside chart is the original Plave chart. Outside chart is upcoming March 12th, 2026 at 12 p.m. So we use the same time and the same location. Now, what I want to talk about is because when you look at all of this together, the timing of Plave's third anniversary becomes really interesting to me when I was looking at it. So, in traditional astrology, the third year focuses towards communication, refinement, and systems. So, just a quick little Astro 101 is that whenever we are born, um, there's a certain of levels, right, that we go through. And when we are born, the last house where, and that's why there's a correlation to the ascendant being very important, is because the first house, which is the ascendant, is where we come through, right? That's why it's very important. That's why that's the only house that really represents us and only us. Um, so when looking at this chart, whenever we are born, between being born and our first year of life, we are in what's called a first house year. And so typically what we do is we look at the sign, right? So in this case, it's Cancer. So Cancer is ruled by the moon. So the moon is going to be the captain of our ship, which is our life. And so however the moon is doing throughout that first year of life, it's how we are going to be impacted the most, right? Second year, it is ruled by the sun. So what everything the sun is doing in the second year of life between being 1 and 2, right, is going to determine how your life plays out that year. So now we're going from being 2 years old to 3 years old, right? And so that's the third house. And the third house is, again, like I said, it rules communication, refinement, and systems. Um, so now it's less about proving the concept and more about how the concept is maintained, explained, and repeated. Um, with a third house here, this kind of puts a lot of emphasis also on Mercury, which is going to be the captain of their ship because Virgo is ruled by Mercury. Now, when you look at all of this together, the timing of Plave's third anniversary really becomes interesting because in traditional astrology, this year, again, like I was saying with the third house, is going to shift into um, communication, refinement, and systems. And it's less about proving the concept and more about how the concept is going to be maintained, explained, and repeated, which puts a lot of emphasis on the sign of Mercury because Mercury, like I said, I was explaining, is going to be or I'm sorry, it's going to be the captain to their life come their third anniversary. So whatever the condition is for this planet is going to kind of determine like the general vibe of what year number 3 is going to be. Also I like to look at the sun. The sun is exactly where it was first time around when they debuted it. And so the sun is tied to the identity of the group, right? So when we look at this chart, the theme continues, and then Mercury is active and visible, but there's a strong emphasis on that public axis of the chart because, again, it is still um, the MC, which is the highest point in the sky for this particular chart, is still right there next. So Mercury is going to be visible, but it's going to be looking like it's going backwards from our point of view. That's why we call it a retrograde. Um, but there is a sense of there being a strong emphasis on on how they are perceived publicly. So it's not about reinventing themselves at all. It's almost a clarification because Mercury is retrograde. It's not, to our point of view from Earth, it's looking like it's going backwards, right? So it's kind of like working with like much older stuff. And I feel like that's a big indication as to um Caligo Part 2, right? Because it's not like they're going to be revisiting a whole brand new concept, but kind of like really bringing back a way to be able to finish or continue that story. So again, it's not like, you know, right away out of the bat, brand new concept or anything like that. It's more of like, what are we clarifying this year, right? And now the interesting thing about this also is that it has a Jupiter rising chart. So first off, obviously they're still very much close, like still have almost the same ascendant degree, which is Cancer at 0 degrees, and this chart for their upcoming birthday has Cancer 1 degree. But the interesting thing is because Jupiter is currently in the sign of Cancer, it's going to have a Jupiter rising chart, which means points of growth through emotional connection, familiarity, wow, and trust. So Jupiter brings this level of expansion. And then obviously Cancer is ruled by the moon, so it brings on the emotions. So expansion happens by deepening what already is working, not by changing the core of it. And what's already working is how the they communicate that emotion, right? Which is, we go back to the original chart, where we have Moon in Scorpio trining that Mercury in Pisces, how they communicate, right? So what's already working is working. Let's not change that. Let's work with what's already working and tweak where it needs to tweak, but what's already working works. Let's just add to it. Now, at the same time, because Mercury is the captain of their ship for their third anniversary, that whole ninth house is going to be activated. Um, and along with that too, I want to say that all these planets kind of also bring emphasis to that third year as well. And with Saturn and Neptune moving into Aries, it also adds um an activation to that 10th house. So this whole ninth house, 10th house to me is I feel like it's very important for this year. And so a lot about their public image is going to be at the forefront for year three. Because Saturn and Neptune are shifting into Aries, that usually shows an increase of responsibility around their public image and clearer boundaries, right? Clearer messaging and more of a defined role within how they show up. So overall, this year does look like for Play to become a little bit more settled into who they are, more confident, more intentional. And because Saturn is going into their public image, the structure is going to tighten and the message is going to become even clearer. Um, so I think it's a very positive year for Plave. They are really they've had worked really behind the scenes and making sure that um that the whole idea of Plave is very much straightforward, but also can be received. I hope that makes sense. Um, but when you put all of this together as a whole, the reason the concept works is because structure actually supports their identity, right? So the virtual format isn't fighting who they are, it's kind of working along with who they are. And I feel like that's why the fandom's connection feels very stable and consistent. So I only see good things right now with this solar return. So um yeah, I just only see them growing more and more based on what I'm seeing for their third year. So I'm excited for what's coming for them. But if you enjoyed this K-pop astrology breakdown for Play, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. It really does help. And I'm also genuinely very curious as a plea myself if this resonates with how you feel about Plave. I do love reading through the comments and seeing how you receive this breakdown. Does it resonate? Does it not? And I do want to say, kind of bringing back to what I mentioned earlier when I started the video, is that I've been doing a lot of research around why we tend to resonate more deeply with certain groups rather than others. Not in a member to fan compatibility way. I don't do that kind of astrology, but in terms of like group charts, right? And share themes. Why does this group feel like your group, right? Why others you can be like, oh, okay, I can listen to them. I can vibe. But why some groups really make sense for you. And if you know your placements and feel comfortable with sharing, I'd be really interested to see if it shows up consistently in the comments, right? Like especially if like things like the moon and your Venus placements align with Plave's chart or have really like good um aspects to the chart of Plave. And if there are other groups that you would like for me to cover as far as K-pop astrology, do let me know. Um, we do have a Discord for the Fangirls React channel. There is a specific astrology chat there. If you want to kind of nerd out a bit with me. Now, right now, I'm not doing personal readings. I'm trying to see um what I can add to Patreon because I'm currently in the process of moving and so I can't I can't add on that. But if you do want to talk about astrology and charts, this space is available on Discord, and it will be linked below as well. And finally, we do also have a Patreon that already has a lot of Plave content already up in there. Now I am trying to also figure out what kind of like astrology related content you would actually want from me over there to cover. So if there is something that you're interested, like concepts, group chart deep dives, timing discussions, feel free to let me know. Just because I'm trying to figure out how to show up astrologically. Um, just a little FYI or TMI. Yeah, TMI is what I meant to say. Um, I have been very much called to um talk about how I work with astrology. Like I've been constantly getting that gut feeling of like, just talk more about it. But I'm still trying to figure out in what way I can like do it aside from like what I'm doing right now, which is K-pop astrology. Um, I for some reason have this like this nudge of like helping people with astrology. I just don't know myself how to like be like of help, if that makes sense. So if there is something that um you know might be curious about that I could bring via Patreon, please don't hesitate to either join the Discord or join Patreon, send or comment below, to let me know what you might be interested in, as far as that. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this breakdown of Plave. And again, please let me know if there's any other groups you want me to do, as far as uh, the one thing that I can do still Plave related and astrology related is I could definitely, once we do have a comeback date, we can look at the comeback chart against their own natal chart or birth chart and see and kind of predict a little bit of what the vibe is going to be for their next comeback. And we can do that. Hopefully, this is out by Noah's birthday. So if it is, happy birthday, Noah. And yeah, I will catch you guys on the flippity flip. I will catch you guys on the next play reaction. See you guys there. And of course, if you're on Discord, see you over there. But hope you guys enjoyed this video. And again, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe and turn the notification bell on. Okay, I've talked too much. Bye.